Are are we live? Yes, we are live. Hello, everybody, and welcome on to one of my Saturday streams. And as people have already seen and commented, today we're getting right on back into talking about D&D. I do want to start with a quick apology for people who are showing up that have been following these streams for a while now about last weekend having to cancel my Saturday stream. It was unfortunate, but some scheduling things got in the way, so we had to delay to today. But that means today we will be talking about my homebrewing of races and classes for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. We will be taking a look about how I homebrew and balance these kind of fundamental and building blocks of a Dungeons and Dragons game. And once we kind of talk about how I go about the process, we'll go ahead and break into showing off some of the races and the classes I've homebrewed already, or at least I've been in the process of homebrewing, as they have all been getting worked on and off for quite a while. Once we get on through talking about homebrewing races and classes, we'll move right on into the next part of our little story time and discover what happens next in the campaign I am DMing. But before we get into all of that, how's everybody doing today? Anyone got any fun weekend plans going on or coming up? Hell, tomorrow, Sunday, is the day I play D&D, so my campaign's going to be continuing on ahead with some very exciting things. How, Frost, you're doing good. That's good to hear. You said this is your first time popping into one of my D&D streams. Well, I do hope you are going to be entertained. Have you played Dungeons and Dragons much before, or at all? Because in this first part, we're going to be talking mostly about homebrewing stuff. Once we get through all that, we'll be going into talking about my campaign. And don't worry, there'll be a little recap of what happened last time. I'm doing good. Okay, Wood Bogus. Honestly, it's really good to have no plans sometimes. When you wake up on the weekend and you know you've got something to do, it almost ruins half the enjoyment. VODs yet? Yeah, I used to play 3.5, Homebrew, and 5th edition. Nice. Well, if you want to ever catch up on any of the D&D streams I've done before, I do have an archive channel set up on YouTube that has only my D&D streams locked in there. So if you're ever feeling lost or you want to see how I create a world, how I go about homebrewing magic items, or just catch up on the story of my campaign so far, you can always pop on there and watch the chapters that you need. But with that all done, I feel like we're pretty well and truly set to start talking about homebrew, balance, and what it's like to go about homebrewing races and classes for Dungeons and Dragons. So, the very first thing to keep in mind if you're getting into a game, any tabletop game really, that allows a level of homebrewing to exist or that people do homebrew for, is the most important thing to remember for Dungeons and Dragons homebrew is that races and classes are some of the fundamental pieces that the game is built and balanced upon. When you start homebrewing this stuff, even more so than magic items, definitely more so than creating a setting, a world, or a lot of other elements in the game, like home rules that solve some edge cases or some other bits and pieces. These are going to be some of the most pervasive rules throughout a player's time with a campaign. Meaning, these are some of the most dangerous to touch on and to start making up on your own without throwing the balance of everything a little out of whack. Now, interestingly, for games like Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games, when you discuss balance, you do have quite a bit of wiggle room. Because while these games are balanced in a sense, they're not balanced exactly. Hey there, Gremlin. Don't worry, we will not be spreading news about this to anyone you wish us not to tell. After all, this is Dungeons and Dragons, the dark cult of the world. So, balance is very important to keep in mind, but also to remember that Dungeons and Dragons is balanced more so on a scale. Some classes, some races are a little bit stronger or weaker than others in some elements, in a lot of elements. So it's always important when you're trying to homebrew these features specifically to keep the general window of balance in mind. Coming back and constantly comparing your own race or class that you're building to other existing elements is going to help you the most in maintaining a strong balance. The other thing to remember is, with all things that you make on your own, but particularly when it comes to a race or a class, is there's always a draw to make them the most special, the most interesting. I'm not in the fire, I'm in front of the fire. What are you talking about? It's simply a nice warm and toasty for me to sit down in front of. There we are. And once we get into the story time, I'll stretch it out so we have a big screen for everybody to be warm and toasty in front of. Now then. While there's always a fear of trying to make your race or class the most interesting, the most unique, and in a way start to debalance things around this idea, also, for anybody out there into homebrewing or even just playing around with the features, don't shy away from interesting mechanics, from interesting interactions. Just remember to, holy shit! It has been a while since I've seen one of those bots. Hello there. Of course I want to become famous. Everybody say hello to the bot. And let's get back to it. So don't shy away from interesting ideas, concepts, or interactions, but always remember to be constantly checking back in with what already exists, and especially on your most unique ideas, constantly checking and rechecking them to make sure everything is falling within that window of balance. Of course, balance isn't everything. Most people don't go into creating a class or a race from scratch in order to rebalance a game or because they enjoy the process of balancing. No shame at all for those who love to balance, to fiddle with the numbers and find that perfect spot. But most people begin with inspiration. And so I'm going to talk a bit about what drew me to a lot of my homebrewing for different races, different classes, and the different elements I've created and I'm working towards sort of bringing into their own little personal supplement of mine. The first thing I like to start with when looking at an inspiration for a race, a class, or anything I'm bringing in is, what is it about the game, the lore, the world, the features you've played with in the past that you absolutely love? Features that cause you to go out and search up more and more information on because it just draws you in. There are two reasons it's really good to look for these major draws, these bits of lore, these areas or ideas that fascinate you. The first is By simply being so fascinated that you keep seeking out more information on it, there'll be a point when you have a really strong idea of what the existing expectations for that area are. What things from there should feel like, what elements of it should be strong or weak. And that really helps you build out the bits and pieces that you don't have specifically imagined in your head. If you're fascinated with the angelic or the celestial beings, being able to just have in the back of your mind how they rise or fall, how they're created, what draws out their desires, their wills, their personal standings, is very great to help you when what you've really been thinking about is what features or powers this race or class should have. The second reason I say to always look for these areas of fascination for you is that most important thing, that you begin to see the areas where there's lore or ideas on it that just aren't oftentimes directly represented through mechanics, through in-game interactions, through the bits and pieces that you play with. To give the example of what I have begun to do, in the lore of Dungeons and Dragons from 4th edition to 5th edition, my two areas that I've been most fascinated with the change and the lore around are the Shadowfell and the Feywilds, these sort of dark or amazing mirrors of the material realm that just lie so close to it that it's so easy to cross into, yet they're somehow drastically different, drastically familiar. The Fey and Fell are areas that fascinate me greatly. And that is how I grew inspired to start up my own little beginnings of a supplement that I call Alexander Perrault of Fey and Fell. A collection of a few classes, subclasses, and several races of beings that all originate in some fashion from the Shadowfell or from the Feywilds, a way to kind of bring in a lot of those elements that exist on a more visceral level to the game. A way to kind of theme and flavor the ideas I had for Homebrew and give them a real shell and existing element of the lore to occupy, to live within, and to draw out more creativity from myself. So, with that all covered, how I get inspired, how to consider balance, and how to consider inspiration. If everybody is so excited, we might now begin by taking a look into some of the races and classes I have personally created. For anybody interested in taking a look at these, either along with me or at some later date to take a look, I am always open to hearing notes, opinions on my homebrew. I know I'm not the perfect balancer the first few times through, and most of these elements I've actually been working on for about a year now. On and off for a lot of my races, though. The Shade class I've been making is certainly the one I've been most focused on the development of. But that will also be the one we get to last. Instead of starting with any of the classes or subclasses, I would love to start by looking at the races I've made. And so, for our first look, we shall dive into the Feywild to learn about a race that has actually existed in Dungeons & Dragons for a long time, though not always as a playable race. The Banshray, an insect-like being from deep within the Feywilds. Sometime in the middle of our third week through the Fey, one of the rangers in our band called out saying there was a palace he knew up ahead. As we changed course to follow his guidance, he told me that I might enjoy a chat with the lady of that glade. At the time, I thought very little of his chuckling. The rangers all tended to be awed about how seriously I took this venture, but I would soon learn. We came to a mighty tree adorned with white silk and studded with balconies of many different styles, each growing like a unique fungus. As the light of the glade bent around the tree, it seemed to exhale a cloud of butterflies from its branches and leaves. The very air around me seemed to be filled with them, and they created a cloud of lifeful colors around us, giving the whole structure the feeling of floating on a cloud, yet made of butterflies. From a balcony higher and brighter than the rest, her face emerged, pale and blank, soft, elegant. She looked down at our band, and the butterflies enwrapped us in a torrent of colors, as dozens of fairies, sprites, lipids emerged from the surrounding wood, welcoming us to their heavenly lady's palace. Soft wings sprang from the lady's back, displaying wild patterns in dozens of colors, reflecting every single color her swarm possessed. I heard her voice in my head as she greeted me, asking if I came to join her joyous court. As her wings fluttered and the shifting, bright pattern took my mind and threw it to her swarm, I would have agreed to serve her forever. As my mouth opened and my pledge caught in my now dry throat, I was saved by a rough cuffing from the Gloomrot Ranger. He later told me that the Banshray hymns, which the lady was, made games to see how many different creatures they could have serving them at once, and she would gladly keep me enchanted forever, for no other reason than to prove that she could. Now I know why the Lipid Band avoid this place, and how so many of them disappear. Of course, Gremlin Hunter, if you want to find any of the documents we'll be talking about today, I have a Nightbot command that is !Alex. ALEX. If you do it, it should pull up a Google Doc that will direct you to any of the races and classes we discussed today. As you can see, this is one of my most developed races right now. The Banshray I've already given several basically flavor passes to after I sort of finalized their balancing pass. This opening blurb is kind of an element I see that Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition used a lot for all of their existing races, and so a lot of this is formatted in a way very similar to how the normal player's handbook works. Now, there's obviously some typos and grammar stuff. There's still a few passes I need to give to it. Though I always find myself slacking a little bit on the final flavor elements. More so interested in breathing life into the mechanics of the being. The Banshray are tall and thin fey creatures, often sporting insectoid appearances. They lack any apparent mouth and yet are known to be masters of both the flute and the blowpipe. They love creating music that could enchant the very air around them. They're most commonly known for their strong drive towards trickery and deception, often becoming obsessed with a single focus of their intentions, playing frequent and escalating pranks on them, only ceasing once their focus has become uninteresting or has died. Within the race, it is not uncommon for them to gain or take on the attributes of other natural beings, most commonly insects. All Banshee are of one race, but they often do not relate to their own kind, seeing them as either individuals or specialized tribes, as they embrace more of the mind of their subrace. They can even be driven to view other Banshee as lesser than themselves. The most apparent detail to note about the Banshee is their lack of mouth, coupled with their race's love of music and flutes. What little can be gleaned about this peculiarity points towards an ancient curse upon the race, in a very similar vein to that upon the Kenku. Long ago, some ancient force cursed them to never speak or sing, leaving them empty in many regards. They are most interesting among the Fae for seemingly wishing to ignore the rules placed upon them by ancient powers, illustrated by their use of flutes and blowpipes as their main weaponry. While all Fae embody the chaos of the realm they are born from, most feel driven to embrace and honor their deals and curses. Banshee, instead, embody rebellion against this. The Banshee will always be the last to speak on their curse, and will only do so with a high level of bitterness and absolute refusal of trackable detail. It can only be guessed at whether voice and song were the only things the race lost to whatever ancient force they angered so totally, or if their horrid hunger for ever-escalating pranks takes root in their past as well. As I have mentioned, the Banshee were actually inspired by an existing monstrous race in D&D. I believe it was more so talked about, and a lot of the lore existed from 4th edition. But, as everyone knows, I have a friend who has a very interesting insectoid opinion, and one that inspired me to kind of dig through the lore a bit, to find a race that I thought I could play around with to give sort of this homebrew race from the Fae a more insectoid feel. I wasn't so interested in recreating the Thri-Kreen that had existed before, but doing something a little more new and something a little more placed within either Shadowfell or the Feywilds. And so now we enter into how I decided to play around with introducing several insects into this one race. The Banshee have 3 major subclasses, known as the Coal, the Leopard, and the Him, each of which represent a group of insects. The Coal are dark, beetle-like Banshee that have gained a thick, exoskeleton-like shell that can deflect the attacks of most common creatures. They're often shorter than the average Banshee and slightly less chaotic, tending towards guardian positions or seeking independent ways to prove their martial prowess. They are often employed by fellow Fae as resolute guards or combat champions, the more colorful of which frequently become favored duelists of more court-oriented Fae. Among the Fae, the Coal are often seen as almost boorish and simple, but any mortal to face them in combat quickly learns that they are enthusiastic employers of trickery, mockery, and taunting through their combat. The Coal obsession only becomes observable during extended combat, where they will move unceasingly towards embarrassing or manipulating their opponent. The Leopard are the most obviously insectoid, possessing segmented torsos and highly developed antennae. They are extremely hive-minded and often obsessively create and protect large families of similar-minded creatures. While group-oriented and attuned to their hive's emotions, they're often prone to driving their families into the most extreme and chaotic of decisions, always joining their collective but subtly pushing it towards their own goals. When leopards develop an agreeing collective, they will strive to find a nearby target to vent their more chaotic nature on. They can oftentimes be individuals, but are more often other groups, such as tribes or small villages, found near their own hive. Their pranks and trickery are always highly coordinated and can quickly grow to extremes. However, they are often just as quickly abandoned, as a single mind shifting away to a new focus can pull the entire hive to drift to this new subject. And finally, the him. The him are the most narcissistic of the sub-races I have studied, and the most individualistic at that. While the coal may seek the solitary to hone themselves, the hymns seek it to highlight themselves. All hymns seek to become the better of all around them, seeing themselves as superior and often isolating themselves behind palaces, vast gardens, and hordes of lesser servants. Their soft wings allow them a level of flight, but they are more commonly used for their ability to charm and manipulate their lessers with enchanting patterns of color and reflective surfaces. When engaging in trickery, the him embody their royal opinions and often endeavor to create a myth about themselves to drive peasants or heroes to seek them out. Their favorite form of trickery are the creation of silly, impossible, or nonsensical quests, each topped with its own uniquely inane reward. They tend to have a favored target of their requests and rewards, but also see it as their victim's duty to come to them. Their drive to continually draw in their chosen hero for their pranks often leads to rapid shifts between outlandishly peculiar tasks and rewards and meeting out their victim's dearest desires, if only temporary. Here you can see a collection of possible Banshray names. Like all Fae, the Banshray are chaotic at their core, though can often feel bound by their promises when given thrice. Their chaotic tendencies appear most obvious in their prank-like nature and erratic morals, driving them to reassess their values whenever a new opportunity becomes evident. The coal and the leopard have been known to slip towards lawful when either their duty or hive is concerned, but oftentimes are closer to a neutral stance, staying trustworthy for those they see as family, but oftentimes they see beings predictably chaotic as being better. The Banshray, in most respects, do not stand on either side of good or evil. Like most Fae, they don't fully understand mortals and can oftentimes come across as cruel because of this. Where they can stay decidedly evil, though, is where their chosen target for pranks is concerned. While always starting more playful and innocent, a Banshray will always elevate their jokes on its favored victim, increasingly holding no feelings of remorse for whatever may befall that creature, unless, of course, it may prevent them from returning to her for future pranks. With that, we've covered a lot of the lore that I've built up over time to fill out this kind of race of the Banshray. A lot of it is borrowed from existing elements that are discussed about them, though I found finding a lot of solid info on the Banshray to be difficult beyond the discussions of their curses and Fae-like nature. There are some mentions of them being prank-like, but I really wish to elevate that with the lore, make it more something that is universal but unique for each of the subclasses. After all, I wanted them to be able to cover a vast insectoid appearance and not simply a singular look like other races have. They are, by being Fae, inherently attuned to nature, which grants them a +1 to wisdom. They are considered medium and have a walking speed of 30 feet. They can understand, read, and write Common, Elvish, and Sylvan, but, much like the Kenku, they cannot speak. With their Fey ancestry, they have advantage on saving throws against being charmed, and magic cannot put them to sleep. And most importantly for them, they are all telepathic and can project their thoughts into a target's mind that is 30 feet away, as long as both share a language in common. With that, you understand sort of the basic elements of the Banshray, their wisdom, their Fey ancestry, and how they communicate. But most importantly for each Banshray is their sub-races. The first is the Cole, the warrior beetles. They gain a +2 to dexterity and gain an unarmored AC equal to 13 plus their dex mod, due to their natural exoskeleton. Their exoskeleton also allows them, whenever another creature hits you with a melee attack, you can use your reaction to add 1d4 to your AC for that attack, potentially causing the attack to miss you. You cannot use this feature again until your next short or long rest. The next is the Lepid, the swarm, more ant-like creatures. They gain a +1 to wisdom and dexterity, giving them a total of +2 to wisdom, +1 to dexterity. They are hive-minded, meaning their telepathic range is increased to 60 feet. And they're able to project guiding thoughts. When an ally makes an attack roll or an ability check within your telepathic range, you can use your reaction to add 1d4 to the roll. You cannot use this feature again until your next short or long rest. And now finally, the moth or butterfly-like hymns gain a +2 to their charisma score, and they uniquely possess Feyan wings. They have a fly speed of 20, additionally taking off as an action, similar to standing from prone, using half your speed. And their wings can create a hypnotic pattern. Whenever you or an ally makes a charisma skill check targeting a creature or object you can see, you may use your reaction to add 1d4 to the roll. Additionally, whenever an enemy that can see you makes a charisma saving throw, you may use your reaction to subtract 1d4 from their save after the save is rolled. You cannot use this feature again until your next short rest. As I've kind of said a few times, the Banshray were very much inspired by wanting to bring sort of an insectoid appearance into one of my races, particularly the Fey race. I like the idea of having a race that kind of embodies a few different appearances and effects, but all sort of draw from a similar vein, which the Banshray, with this small insect edit to their original lore, really allows me to play around with. As you've likely seen, for them, a key feature is being able to use their reaction to add or subtract a 1d4, which I kind of kept consistent across all these sub-races, but also each of them work in different ways. The Cole are the more martial, and so their bonuses are around dexterity, AC, kind of that combat area. The Lepid, being the hive-minded and more group-oriented, their bonuses range around basically a better help action. And then the hymns, being the charming, more enchanting beings, their bonuses are based around charm effects or saving throws. The Banshray, I believe, are one of my most completed races at this point. One I loved building, and one I do hope, if Junie ever comes through the stream and takes a look at, will be very inspired by. Are there any questions, any comments, anything people see specifically around the Banshray race that they're really curious about, that they're really interested in? Questions about how I started building them, my process for balancing or creating kind of these lore or flavor elements. Anything about them. These are going to be one of the longer ones we spend time on simply because they're the most complete, but if anybody wants to take advantage of a bit of time. Yes, there was a more warrior-focused one. So that would be the beetle-like coal subrace. Here. So the base bonuses they get are +1 to wisdom. As the coal, then you gain an additional +2 to dexterity and an unarmored defense, alongside the use of your exoskeleton. The exoskeleton allows you to use your reaction to every short rest against one attack, increase your AC for a moment, which can be very useful at times. If you're just coming in, Rageonomics, if you would like, you are free to take a look at any of this, either to follow along or to look back at any info or to steal it if you're so inclined. That link will take you to an overall page, and from there, you can look around. So the Lepids are somewhat hive-minded. They aren't literally a singular-minded being. The Banshray are one race, and these are all sub-races. The Lepid are simply the most connected telepathically to each other, and so as they all communicate constantly, check in, check opinions, they tend to behave in a very hive-minded manner. Something that also can be plugged into a party very easily, where a Lepid finds itself constantly talking to its allies, incorporating or influencing them, and kind of building into very interesting directions. This is pretty cool. Thank you very much. Yes. I had to take a moment to, of course, start with the one that I had most completed at this time. The one I had most of the kind of flavor, lore, and balancing elements done with. So now let's move on to one with a little less balance and much less flavor finished for. Oh, Cheese Knight. Is the Himsfey wing caveat of taking off as an action, similar standard link for pro, using half your speed, true of all flight? So that is only true for the hymns. I personally actually do use that as a house rule for all flight, but that is not a baseline flight rule. It's also one I've considered removing since I mostly just use that because I prefer it. But I also do imagine the him having a softer, more insect-like wing, one that takes a moment for getting kind of the whole him off the ground, and is supposed to kind of push it more in the direction of thinking of this not as a flight wing, but more so as a enchantment tool that they have available to them. Now, this should be one people are a bit more familiar with if you have played much D&D before, especially if you've ever looked into the Shadowfell. I'm gonna go to bed and fall asleep listening to the stream. Have fun. Oh, no problem, Brainless. I hope you've had fun so far. Next, we will talk a bit about the Shadar Kai. For those interested in a quick look. Oh, 1 second. I don't seem to actually have that posted quite yet. So the Shadar Kai is actually a race that has existed in D&D for a long time. They are most known as a Shadowfell elf race. Basically, a group of elves that had gotten themselves trapped in the Shadowfell for a long time, which had greatly influenced their minds, physical abilities, and basically shaped them in the same way that the Drow were shaped by the Underdark. These were a race that I believe had a 4th edition supplement that made them playable, but I don't think have been really a playable race or a baseline race in almost any other edition. Let Eric's honey voice serenade your cochlea as you drift into your dreams. This was one that I felt would do a good job of filling out the Shadowfell side of the races. As you can see, I don't have anywhere near the same level of flavor work done for them, though I have spent a lot of time playing around with one of my more interesting ideas for mechanics. As discussed, the Shadowkai are technically of elven origin, but have been within the Shadowfell for so long that all Feyan effect upon them has been faded or muted with time. They have become more cruel, more apathetic, dark reflections of what the Fae should be. Their dexterity score is increased by 2, and wisdom is increased by 1, a shadow of what most elves are like. Their base walking speed is 30 feet. They also gain the feature of fell dark vision. Accustomed to life in the shadows, you have superior vision in dark and dim conditions. You can see in dim light within 120 feet of you, as if it were bright light, and in darkness as if it were dim light. You can't discern color in darkness, only shades of gray. Additionally, you have advantage on all wisdom checks that rely on vision when you are in dim light or darker. However, you also gain sunlight sensitivity. You have disadvantage on attack rolls and wisdom perception checks that rely on sight when you, the target of your attack, whatever you are trying to perceive, is in direct sunlight. Fell ancestry. You have advantage on saving throws against being frightened, and magic cannot blind you. Fell ancestry was something I kind of created based off of the model of Fey ancestry, which is a very common feature elves and other playable Fey races have, which makes them immune to being charmed or put to sleep. On the Fell side, I wanted to give something very similar, but also kind of captured that opposite side, where they, instead of can't be charmed, can't be frightened. And while not immune to sleep, they are immune to a magical blinding. And now we get into the feature I have changed and reworked the most for the Shadar Kai. Their deadened souls. Whenever you hit an enemy with an attack, you may use a bonus action to roll a d6. You take that much necrotic damage, and the target suffers that plus your wisdom modifier of necrotic damage. Starting at 5th level, the target takes twice that die's damage plus your wisdom modifier. The inspiration for the Deadened Souls is based around a lot of the lore, with the Shadar Kai being grim torturers that engage in levels of self-harm to maintain themselves as living beings within the Shadowfell. One of the chief features of the Fell that affects all beings within it is its slow draining of chaos, of life, of inspiration. Over time, all beings or races within Shadowfell begin to become muted, simple, without reason, without true life to them. Which is why mostly only the undead exist here. To counteract this, the Shadar Kai have begun to learn how to inflict pain in such a way to keep themselves alive and vigorous. The idea of sacrificing some of your health to deal additional damages is also something that other Homebrewed likes to play around with a lot, though you don't see a lot in a lot of the official work. I do know Matt Mercer's Blood Hunters is a class built a lot around this sacrifice for additional effects. And so I wanted to create a race that sort of played around with this effect inherently, but not powerfully. Something near the same level of a Bugbear's 2d6 sneak attack or a Goblin's Fury of the Small. Something that came with a cost reward, but that was definitely beneficial more so than harmful. The result is its current state. I feel like I'm listening to an audiobook. Well, thank you very much, Alexander. I do hope me saying you by name doesn't ruin the effect at all. And so that... Eric has constant ASMR voice. And so that covers this kind of small, purely mechanical build I have for the Shadar Kai. For anyone interested, there already exists a lot of lore and existing ideas about how the Shadar Kai behave, their ages, alignments, and everything like that. And so I encourage anyone curious about those elements to go and seek it out. I think that's probably part of the reason I've failed to really do a lot of the work in putting in the elements here, simply because I've enjoyed more so building out their deadened soul and getting it to its current state than I have simply refinding and regurgitating their existing lore. However, with that... Well, thank you very much, Super Grump. I appreciate that. We will transfer back to the Fae for a moment to discuss another race that's gotten a good deal of work, one that has had some reference in the past, yet due to their dark origins, has been somewhat avoided in many editions. The Forlorn race. When I was first told of Sarah Nymphbane, I thought I would meet some reclusive tiefling, a person so driven by coin as to overlook the beauty of the Fae that I had been raised on in exchange for hunting them for the more gory ingredients that many mages sought. When I saw her, it became clear, quickly, that none of that was true. She was scrawny, bald, and held the attention of a troop of men that looked every bit the money-grubbing trappers I had been expecting. Yet she was nothing like them. The very first thing I noticed about her were her eyes, a light golden amber color. While she spoke with her fellow hunters, as she turned towards our own troop of rangers, her eyes immediately turned a dark, angry orange. The second thing I noticed were her legs and the cloven hooves she had. Sarah was not a tiefling, nor any race of mortal I'd met before. She was instead something much rarer, that would teach me more of the Fae than I would have liked to learn. That night at dinner, after she learned I aimed to bring out a book of the truths of the Fae, she told me her story, or at least the parts she wished to share. Sarah was something called a Forlorn, a creature made of both infernal and Faean blood. She would share nothing about how her parentage occurred. Instead, she spent hours of the night shedding light on those mystical beings called nymphs, and why she would personally wipe their ilk from the world. Her life story is ultimately her own, and one I will not share here. But as she spoke, I could swear her eyes turned coal red, and the talons anointing her hands grew longer in the golden light of their peace. Forlorn are a small piece of the Fae, made normal for us mortals, fascinating, enchanting in their rage. They are the pits of the abyss brought forth. Forlorn are creatures both strange and familiar, They most closely resemble tieflings in appearance, sporting strangely colored skin and fanciful horns. They also adopt some features of elven races, like the Faish, beautiful faces and pointed or animal-like ears. Where they differ is seen in their legs and feet. They sport a pair of goat-like legs ending in cloven hooves, though strangely devoid of any hair or fur. Additionally, they are known to develop strange barbed talons and spikes on their hands and forearms. What truly drives the Faloran is their shared cursed lineage, ever pulled between two extreme parentages within them. The Faloran are cursed beings in many respects, created by the union of a fiend and a nymph. Their very nature is often trapped in a constant conflict with itself. Worse is the issue of an inconsistent parentage. Neither nymphs nor fiends are renowned for their empathy or parental instincts, and Faloran are often abandoned or neglected early on in their lives. Faloran are racked with seemingly random shifts in opinions and mood, driven by either their fiendish or the Feyan blood taking dominance. They could shift rapidly between excitable and fiery fits, driving them to rely on their natural talents and killer instinct, then suddenly become overwhelmed with fits of remorse as their Feyan blood takes hold. Combine this with commonly being dominantly self-raised, the Faloran find themselves driven from most populous civilizations due to their strange behaviors and dangerously erratic moods. Without a true home or family, Faloran are often driven to eke out an existence on the edges of mortal society, seeking work that can allow them to vent their fiendish anger without fear of guilt. They are often pulled towards bounty hunting, ranging, or providing guidance through areas populated by those who share a Feyan parentage. Being so individualistic and nomadic often leads to short, lonely, and violent lives, consumed by hatred of all around them, including themselves. The most famed of the Faloran become hunters of Fey and Fiend, spurring on their anger and resentment towards their own heritage, becoming the best and most feared in their areas of speciality. The Faloran are known to keep the fiendish or Feyan names given by their parents, but it is more common for scorn to drive them to adopt a new name. These newly selected names are often simplistic and reflect either their deeds or how they see themselves, ranging from hunter, lone, nymphbane, or honored. The Faloran intelligence scored is decreased by 2. Inspired by the old monstrous race style, I might actually have to change that now that Tasha's has come out and removed a lot of negative ability scores. You may choose to increase either your wisdom or charisma by 2, and either your dexterity or your strength by 1. Remember, the Faloran are driven in 2 directions at all times, and I wanted their creation and their abilities to reflect a sort of dividing point in their life. Faloran are constantly at odds with both their heritage, often shifting erratically between their good and evil sides. Both their heritage and upbringing push them towards the chaotic nature of the Fae and the evil nature of fiends. Florin have a base walking speed of 25, making them on average a bit slower than some of the other races in the world. However, they do have dark vision. Thanks to your blood, you have superior vision in the dark and dim conditions. You can see in dim light within 60 feet of you as if it were bright, and in darkness as if it were dim light. You cannot discern color in darkness, only shades of gray. They also, from their nymph parents, gain fey ancestry, and have advantage on saving throws against being charmed, and magic cannot put them to sleep. From their fiendish parents, they gain hellish resistance, a resistance to fire damage. They can speak, read, and write Common, Sylvan, and Infernal. And now we get to the most dividing point of them, their cloven existence feature. Split between your two halves, you find yourself often radically changing between your most infernal and Feyan sides. After each long rest, you roll a d20. On a roll from 1 to 10, you gain the benefits of fiendish blood until your next long rest. On an 11 to 20, you gain the benefits of Feyan blood until your next long rest. Starting at 3rd level, you gain the option to add or subtract 1 from this roll. This value increases by 1 at levels 5, 8, 11, and 14. Here you begin to see what I really wanted to do with the Forlorn, is create a race that's sort of divided between two sides, and one you can play around with some randomness on. Basically, every day in game, after you've taken a long rest, you roll a d20 to see if you're going to be more fiendish or more Feyan for that day. The fiendish blood grants you fiendish barbs. Your unarmed strikes deal 1d6 slashing damage on hit. Additionally, you may treat your unarmed strikes as finesse, using dexterity instead of strength. Whenever you are hit with a melee attack, you may use your reaction to make an unarmed strike against the attacking creature. Additionally, you benefit from something tieflings have, Infernal Legacy. You know Thaumaturgy cantrip, and when you reach 3rd level, you can cast the Hellish Rebuke spell as a 2nd level spell. However, should you roll an 11 to 20 on your Cloven Existence, you instead benefit from your Feyan blood. With Feyan blood, you gain Feyan speed, or your base walking speed is increased to 35. Additionally, when you are targeted by an attack of opportunity, you may use your reaction to impose disadvantage on that attack. And then you gain Feyan Presence, a more Feyish version of the Infernal Legacy. You possess the ability to project the beguiling and fearsome presence of a Fey. As an action, you can cause each creature within a 10-foot cube originating from you to make a wisdom saving throw. Any creatures that fail are either charmed or frightened by you. The Forlorn, I know, of all the races I make, are the most feature-heavy. They have a lot of features available to them. However, half of them are sort of only occasional. The Cloven Existence simply determines the rules for whether you're benefiting from fiendish blood or Feyan blood. But in total, they tend to have around the same number of features as some of the most complex baseline races already do. Something along the lines of the hobgoblins, or I believe the lizard folk have. Or there's a long list of somewhat simple or minor features that affect them. When it comes to the Forlorn, they are the race I think I'm most concerned I've given too many features to, made too interesting in a certain way, and have sort of loaded them in a sense to make them instantly draw a player in, though I do fear the balance of it at times. Which is why I think this is the one I'm most interested in talking to all of you about. What do you think of the lore that I have set up for my Faloran? It draws very heavily on their existing lore, being born between a mixture of a demon and a nymph, or a devil and a nymph. But I wanted to change some elements of that. Something along the lines that always saying it is the demon parentage that is the evil and the nymphs are good, and play around more with this idea that neither the parents are super great at being parents, but are more so missing elements that a real parent would need. The lore is great as far as balance goes, and I know 5e stays away from this, but some sort of social negative could work. I know I did grant them a negative towards their intelligence, sort of being mostly self-taught, though I do like the idea of some sort of negative in the direction of charisma. Again, with the release of Tasha's, I'm sort of less and less drawn to using negative features, and more so seeing if there's features here that are either unnecessary, too powerful, or simply things that I should consider cutting for simplicity's sake. Oh, something that caused animals to panic, stuff like that. That could be interesting. I don't know. It kind of reminds me of the Nephilim. Yes, in a sense, the Faloran were originally made, in their very original lore, exclusively through the forceful copulation between a incubus and a nymph, specifically. But I wanted to open that up a bit more and to remove some of the inherently awful implications of it, and more so imply the issues being more so from parentage than interaction. Having a negative trait a la Kenku is always fun. I think, yeah, that is fun, and I might look around a little bit on it. Like I've said, I feel like they're already feature heavy. Like, if I look at their number of features, excluding dark vision, they've got 1, 2, 3 officially, being their Fey ancestry, hellish resistance, and cloven existence. But then cloven existence will always grant them 2 additional, though changing features. So I do wonder, perhaps, if maybe I should look into stripping out some of these features, whether it's dark vision or their Fey or hellish kind of ancestry, in order to make room for something a bit more negative or balancing. Though, as you can tell, this is one I've spent a lot of time adding features, removing features, balancing, rebalancing, and doubt I'll reach a final great solution to until I've been able to really playtest it a lot. What if a player has to pick between the Fey and the Hellish, kind of implying a more dominant bloodline, I guess? That is definitely something to do. I could also lock both of these behind the kind of cloven existence feature, where if you have your Fey in blood, then you get the Fey in ancestry, but otherwise you don't have any base features. Your features simply swap around every day. Though I wonder if that's too much randomness for real good balanced play. Dwarfs actually have a lot more features? Well, okay. That's reassuring then. I know I'm constantly checking, and I know I don't have more features than any other race here, but I do feel them to be a little feature heavy. I guess my big question is, does everything kind of make sense? Is reading through this, do you feel like you are overwhelmed in any way by all these possible features cropping up? Or is this something you feel, especially if this is one race you've chosen to play around with, that you feel you'd be able to keep straight with every option that these kind of features present to you? Okay. Made a Kenku who killed a man for his voice. As far as the Fae and Fiend go, I support kind of splitting the features into the Cloven ancestry. Actually, yes, you know what, everybody? I think we're going to do it. You're going to watch some live editing here. It is official, the Hellish Resistance and the Fey Ancestry are now being removed from Always features and being placed within their own areas in the bloodline. I feel like I'd run a Faloran. Woo! Honestly, hell yeah. And like I've said, at any point, feel free to take any of this and show it off to DMs or campaigns you're playing. The number one thing I would ask for anybody interested in using any of my homebrew stuff is please, 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 after playing with it, get back to me. It is so hard to play test a lot of these features in a good way when games are often campaign oriented, that really feeling out the balance of a race compared to other races becomes daunting at times. Cool. Well, thank you all for taking a look at that one. We will now move on to my final race. And for that... Oh, yes, of course. And if you ever want it, it is !Alex for Alexander Perrault, the voice of the man who is doing this research. And I'll drop that right now for everybody here. And there you guys go. So now, then we will be moving into the last race, and another one from the Shadowfell. This one is a very interesting one, as it has been a long-standing monstrous... Thank you very much for the follow, Giant Spacecraft Grab. Glad to see you hanging out. And this is a race called the Dark Ones. And let's see, for those interested in a look... The Dark Ones are a long-standing race in D&D, always coming from the Shadowfell. They are very strange in their description, as it seems to shift between short, small beings similar to halflings or gnomes, and tall humanoid creatures. And due to that, I decided to build a race with very divergent sub-races. The most unique fact about the Dark Ones is that their race is made of two unique-looking forms that could never be mistaken for each other. First is the Dark Creepers. They are short and stocky, possessing elongated arms and cloven feet. Their large nose and pointed teeth are what make these, of the two races, the most goblinoid in appearance. But through pigmentation and their inherent magical properties, perhaps a comparison to some fell halfling would be more accurate. The second of their two forms is the Dark Stalkers. They are much more humanoid in appearance, though still clearly fell. They are also far more influenced by the Shadow Realm, possessing pale skin and an atrophied figure. Their permanently baggy eyes give an impression of a man who has spent so long awake as to be near death. They stand twice as tall as their creeper counterparts and possess a muted demeanor, often quiet and precise, while the creepers tend to come across as more verbose and chaotic. Stalkers are often seen as the leaders or the charismatic of the race. Perhaps my most favorite detail about this dualistic race is that each type refer to the company of the opposite, and you are more likely to find Dark Ones in equally split groups or independent pairings of the two sub-races. Ones with shadow. Dark Ones are one of the strangest races of the Shadowfell. They bear the smallest influence of the land's muting effects. They are sinister creatures that take pleasure in small victories at others' expense. one could be easily forgiven for believing them to be some form of fell goblinoid. All dark ones possess a +1 to their dexterity, and their alignment is like most fell. The dark ones are lawful at their core, though expressed differently between the stalkers and the creepers. While both will hold to their word without fail, the creepers are more hesitant to give any promise and remained more bound by tradition and their remaining loyal to their chosen families to any newly met stranger. They're slow to trust and quick to betray those they see as being outside their own code. The stalkers are more relaxed at their word, more willing to parley with new beings, and more trusting. Though still tied to their word, they hold to a more open interpretation of laws and codes. Simply remember that if either half of a pair thinks or decides to be rid of someone, both will hold to their pairing over all other words or codes, to the point that most common pairs to meet are exiles who stuck by each other over the laws of their own homeland. I'm glad to hear you'll be reading through this, Coops. You gonna be heading out then, or are you just saying you're gonna be interested in coming back to this later? If you do come back to it later, please, everyone feel free over Twitch to whisper any ideas, comments, preferences, or changes they'd like to see. And if anyone plays around with these in an actual game in the future, do let me know how it goes. When it comes to size, dark creepers stand from 2.5 to 4 feet tall, though are broader than most would expect for such a height. Their long arms frequently hang lower than their body would be expected to support. They are considered small. Dark stalkers stand at the same height of your average man, though much thinner. They range from 5 to 6 feet tall and are considered medium. I'll be sticking around, just don't want to distract myself from what's currently happening. Oh, gotcha. Their base walking speed is 30 feet. Both possess the fell dark vision. Accustomed to life in the shadows, they have a superior vision in the dark and dim conditions, and can see in dim light within 60 feet, as if it were bright light, and darkness as if it were dim light. Additionally, they have advantage on all wisdom checks that rely on vision when they are in dim light or darker. However, all dark ones possess sunlight sensitivity and have disadvantage on attack rolls and wisdom perception checks that rely on sight when you, the target of the attack, or whatever they are targeting, is in direct sunlight. All dark ones benefit from fell ancestry and gain advantage on saving throws against being frightened, and magic cannot blind them. Dark ones can speak, read, and write common and undercommon. Now then into the sub-races. The dark creepers are the shorter, elongated arm ones. Get a +1 to both their dexterity and wisdom, meaning as a dark one in total, they have +2 to dexterity and +1 to wisdom. They also gain Shadow Cloaked. You know the minor illusion cantrip. When you reach the 2nd level, you can cast Zephyr Strike. When you reach 3rd level, you can choose to learn either Misty Step or the Darkness spell, and can cast them at 2nd level using this trait. You cannot use this feature again until finishing a short rest. This feature was very much inspired by the Tiefling's Ancestry feature, which grants them the use of Thaumaturgy and Hellish Rebuke. Dark Creepers also, however, gain paired dexterity. Whenever a single ally uses the help action to assist you with a dexterity check, you may add their proficiency modifier to the roll. Viventium Umbra. This is all very interesting. I've mostly only homebrewed on the monster side of thing. Dark ones as a player ancestry in 5e. Oh, is a five-head play? Yes. Well, there were two reasons I really wanted to use them. And those reasons come up when you look at the paired dexterity and the Dark Stalker's paired charisma. So the Dark Stalker subrace, however, increases their charisma and dexterity score by 1, meaning they have a +2 to dexterity and a +1 to charisma. They gain Shadow Veiled, which is similar to Shadow Cloaked in that they know the minor illusion cantrip. However, when they reach second level, they can cast Disguise Self. And at third level, they choose between Minor Image or Blur, and can cast that as a second level. They also gain the use of Paired Charisma. Whenever a single ally uses the help action to assist you with a charisma check, you may add their proficiency to that roll. As I discussed in the lore and kind of how I was inspired by them, Dark Ones are a very interesting monstrous race in that they have these two different Dark Creepers and Dark Stalkers that are described so differently in the Monster Manual. But I wanted to bring them together into this strange, dysmorphic sub-race where one was kind of this taller, slightly more charismatic one, and the other was the shorter, stockier, more dexterous one. But I also wanted to tie these two sub-races tightly together. And that's where kind of this idea that Dark Stalkers prefer the company of Dark Creepers, and Dark Creepers prefer the company of Dark Stalkers, meaning they often pair up or keep themselves evenly split so that they can feel most comfortable by interacting only with the opposite subrace. And that plays out in the mechanics of their paired dexterity and their paired charisma. Dark Ones operate best when they have a trusted ally constantly with them, helping them with a specific type of action. For the dexterous Dark Creepers, it is whenever they have an ally near them helping them with their dexterity checks, making it much better for them to be helped with those actions. And for the Dark Stalkers, it's their paired charisma, the same, but obviously for charisma, inspiring this race to be something almost codependent, something I really love the idea of encouraging players to intentionally build characters that are already tied together at the beginning, have already been working together and know that each other works best when someone is helping them or with them. I also wanted to play around with the fact that both when it comes to charisma, whether it's persuasion or deception, or dexterity when it comes to lockpicking or sneaking around, players often feel punished when they've built to be a very good sneak thief and have a player who doesn't have the same dexterity with them just coming along or using a help action. So I wanted to really better reward these races for convincing their not as skilled allies to help them with these features, giving them an extra bonus if they also happen to be proficient. And at later levels, when base proficiency modifiers get higher and higher, it gets very interesting to the point when a person who is your go-to sneak is just constantly saying, but I can do it better if you help me with it. Again, as you can see, not as much flavor development here, though certainly more than the Shadark High. These are again inspired by a monstrous race that I really wanted to play around their duality on and encourage a player race that wants to play with other players in spite of feeling kind of like that dark, brooding, sits in the corner type of race. And so, with that, we draw towards the end of discussing the races. Though I'm curious if anyone has any questions, ideas about the Dark Ones, or at least at this point, about any of my Fey or Fel races that I have available. Any questions about balance, about features, thoughts or opinions, or any other races that anybody knows of from either Shadowfell or the Feywilds? that you've wondered if I'd ever looked into in the past or would be interested in looking at for trying to develop a homebrew baseline mechanic around? I know I've had a lot of fun with the ones I've been working on already, at least mechanically. And I sure hope people are somewhat inspired by these and interested in them and are willing to go out there and play test them for me occasionally. How is everybody? What does everyone think of the Ban Shrey, the Forlorn, the Shadar Kai, and the Dark Ones? Ah. Hmm. Or has my voice unfortunately put all of you to sleep? Wakey, wakey. We've only got one more thing to discuss after this. I think the Faloran are pretty clutch. Well, hell yeah, that's nice to hear. I was only really around for the end, but I'm liking what I'm seeing. All right, Coops. And I think you did get that link, so feel free to look around through everything. The last thing we will be discussing on this page today, though, will be my baby. The one I've been working on for the longest time. And probably one of the most complicated processes I've ever tried to do. If you look around, you can almost always find dozens or hundreds of homebrew races, of homebrew sub-races and subclasses, magic items, monsters, and the like. Something that is more rare to find is the entirely homebrewed class, which is something I unfortunately tried my hand at with the class I call the Shade. I like dissecting of the brooding loner type by making them literally work better with other. Thank you very much, Cheese Knight. It was something I really wanted to do, was play around with kind of this codependent race almost. Been helping a friend homebrew a whole new set of classes for a campaign, so my brain is in balance mode. Hell yeah, Coops. Then right now, we're gonna be going into my homebrew class, the Shade. Now, as Milkblade is talking about, he is one of the players in my current campaign, and my current campaign was the first time I've allowed my Shade class to be playable in a game, and one I'm DMing. The inspiration with the Shade started with the 4th edition race, the Shade, beings that have basically sold their soul for a bit of shadowy power and a connection to the Shadowfell, which grants them the average assassiny and sneaky powers you would expect. However, I wanted to do something very different with the concept of the Shade. There was, when I started homebrewing a class, the first question I asked myself is, what is the niche I want this to fill? And is there a niche that I feel hasn't really been filled? Obviously, rogues, bards, and the like are already really good at the sneaking, the high damage, the sort of martial area that exists in. But there's one thing I know a lot of games use that I don't see quite as much encouraged in D&D, and that is the role of the debuffer. And so when I created the Shade, I created 3 roles, or minor roles, I wanted them to fill. I wanted them to be a tank, a harasser, and a debuffer. A character that can put out some damage, but that's not their chief feature. More so, I wanted them to use shadows and darkness as a way to avoid damage, as opposed to avoid detection. I wanted the Shade to be a shadow across the battlefield, as opposed to one in the corners. We were awoken by a dozen strange, shadowy creatures, clawing and snapping at our dead horses. Before anyone could call the alarm, that pale man had put himself between us and the monsters. They tore into him viciously, but came away with claws full of only shadows and mist. The more they tore, the less purchase they could find, and the more the shadows of the very land seemed to swirl around him. His figure became consumed in its own shadows, and even the starving monsters began to hesitate. The dragonborn woman, who had always stood quietly behind us during times of conflict, suddenly strode forward into the fray. She opened her mouth as if to expel some fiery breath, but instead, the air went cold. The bandits who gazed towards her paled. The very will to fight was pulled from them. The strength of their arms was stolen. Their prowess, their hopes, their very beings were all sucked into the woman's gaping maw. Our men killed the last of the bandits with ease, though. None of us wished she would be called on to help in the future. Shades are all unique in their histories and abilities, but they are all driven to the front of combat. They are best described as a force draining their enemy's strength and will. They are the one at the front, pulling all attention and punishing those who fail to react. They all pull their strength from a secondary force within them, their conduit to the Shadowfell, their bounded soul. Each shade possesses a second soul within them, one marked by Shadowfell, that allows them to access and perform the weird and strange magics that lie in the plane, long seeped in death, fear, and stagnation. Let's see here. The witches class in Pathfinder, they have hexes and curses as well. This is on par with the writing in the actual books. Probably the hardest thing to find in Homebrew. Thank you very much, Coops. Like I've said, I've been working on this baby for well over a year now, and I found myself constantly re-editing, bringing it up, trying to hone in every element, because I really wanted this class as my baby to shine in balance, in lore, and in inspiration. In combat, a shade casts its shadow across every enemy, forcing them to react or suffer. Once fully committed to combat, shades rely on a combination of magic pulled from their own souls. While not as adept at combat as a true fighter or trained paladins, instead, they make use of their unique abilities to bend the battle around themselves. They can absorb or ignore blows that would outright kill other combatants. They can rely on the shadows to harass their enemies, preventing them from properly fighting or even running. A shade may not kill its enemies with each strike, but it will mark them deeply with darkness, robbing them of their strength and transforming a battle into a pit of fear. In combat, a well-trained shade is inevitable, unkillable, and present in every enemy's mind. Shades are not shadows, nor are they hidden in the dark. They are what casts the shadow. They are the most present figure standing between their enemy and the light of hope. Where shades come from? The process used to create a shade can vary wildly between individuals and cultures, but at their core, all shades originate from a series of dark elements seeped in cruelty or tragedy. First and foremost is a soul infused with shadow stuff or fell energy. The second is a method to partially remove or fracture one's own soul. And thirdly, the shade must find a method to combine these two elements into one. The Shadok-Kai have, through their time in the Fell, developed cultural rituals that can supply each of these elements. With each family may hold their own specific ritual secrets, their society as a whole has some intentional ways and rules around the creation of shades. First, a victim must be selected to be ritually sacrificed. Most commonly, this is some favored slave. Then the Shadok-Kai, to be made into a shade, severs half their soul through their family's rites of burial, placing it into a tomb or reliquary. Finally, the slave's soul is bound to the Shadok-Kai by force. To the Shadok-Kai, the process of creating a shade is one of mastery and dominance, which is reflected in their three rules of creation. Never bind one with strong will, for the punishment is rebellion within one's own soul. Never bind the strong together, for the punishment is to be sundered in mind and body. Never bind blood to blood, for the punishment is the total loss of both selves. Amongst those not of the Shadok-Kai, the creation of a shade is almost never intentional. All of those rules are thus frequently broken by the unknowing and unprepared of the material realm. The most common way for a shade to be created outside the Shadowfell is through grief. A person must see themselves as directly or indirectly responsible for the death of someone they care deeply about. They must feel such a level of grief and guilt that they tear their own soul and manage to cast the strands of it into Shadowfell. These strands formed from their powerful focus on their lost loved one will seek that departed soul and bind to it, pulling it back into the material plane, back into themselves. The person that becomes a vessel for that departed soul, and the soul then becomes a conduit for shadow magic. This binding is made unconsciously and without the awareness of either party of what has truly happened. If the two souls should ever become aware of each other within the body, the shade would be faced with not only its guilt for killing the departed soul, but the reality that they have permanently imprisoned it inside themselves. The soul may also be faced with a lifetime of being trapped within one whom they know and who ended their life. They would be unable to influence the world directly without constantly, and will be constantly used to connect to Shadowfell. Most cruelly, soul may be bound to a shade made through means other than grief, when the killer was filled with such strong enough feelings of joy or mastery that their own soul shreds in elation, reaching into the fell to lay dominion over the departed soul. But these figures are rare and altogether terrifying, having claimed power through such unconscious cruelty. I could really see interesting way to do this with a failed lich. Yeah, definitely a lich, especially one who tried to create a phylactery through a method of trying to sacrifice a loved one. No, damn, this is giving me crazy big Jujutsu Kaisen vibes. Dang. Yeah, I might be on milk plate on that. I'm not overly familiar with that. Though if you think it could be a good inspiration, I'll look into it. Those who become shades are faced with serious consequences as the two souls face their new reality. A strong-willed soul can often impose its own beliefs and actions upon the shade. In some cases, the soul can actually slowly assume dominance over the body and become the dominant personality of the shade. In other cases, both souls can end in a state of perpetual rebellion, leading to highly split personalities within a single vessel. Yet, other cases, the souls will actually begin to meld together, as each fail to take dominion, yet will not release its own individuality. When this occurs, the individual minds can shift into a place in between the two souls, become a strange remnant or combination of both. When fusing instead of reaching a middle ground, the souls may instead cling solely to their strongest individuality, creating a mind made of both souls' most extreme features. Typically, within the Shadar-kai, the strong-willed shade will dominate the enslaved soul, as they did with the original slave in life. Even in cases of total dominion, however, small features may still emerge of the soul. A left-handed soul may lead to a shade becoming ambidextrous. Perhaps a new shade is found to become more compliant and less confrontational than they once were. In rare cases, the soul may even welcome each other. This can lead to either a surrender of the vessel's control, granting the departed a new life, as a shade, or the departed soul may embrace its role as shadow and conduit, solidifying it as the shade's shadow. Both figures seemingly unique, yet intertwined. Basic purpose here is to explain that a vessel with two souls is driven in many directions. The shade can dominate the soul, can surrender to the soul, can be split apart, or fuse into something entirely new. When creating a shade, the most important consideration is the event that imbued them with a soul. The shades are often created through immeasurably strong emotions tied to a single event. Deciding what vulnerabilities they had will be the crux of their story. What series event led them to a place where they could make a decision that would fill them with such profound guilt and regret? Beyond that, the relationship between the shade and its bounded soul will set the foundation of how the shade views their own powers, and will shape their present and future plans around the idea of mastery, further guilt, or proof of redemption. Also consider the awareness of the figures. A shade is often created accidentally and without intent, leading to a character with highly varied understanding of their power. Are you oblivious to this change, only knowing what these strange shadows and powers came to you after your guilt took you? Are you aware that something now lies within you, but you don't know who or what it is? Are you and your second soul fully aware and in conflict over your new existence? These ideas will help shape your future as one of discovery, self-reflection, or conflict with a person permanently bound to you. The final element to consider is the relationship between the two souls, should they ever become fully aware of their situation. Shades bring with them permanent reminders of their past sins. This reminder can think and feel and will make itself more and more present the stronger you become. Is this person a welcome one? One to run from or repress? Or something that drives your character forward? Based on how the two souls interact, a character may be likely to change over time. A lawful neutral shade with a neutral evil soul may be pulled into true neutrality, or into the extremes of both, becoming lawful but evil. Will you resist the change and seek dominance with one personality with a lesser servant? Will the souls conflict, creating two unique personalities and beings? Or will you embrace it and watch your character change, becoming something beyond how you planned them? As a quick build, you can make a shade quickly by following a few suggestions. First is to make your constitution your highest score. Your survival, casting ability, shadow marks, all depend on your constitution. Your next highest score should be your strength or dexterity, depending on whether you want to focus on melee weapons or archery or finesse weaponry. Finally, consider your subclass ahead of time, as this will help you select your weapon and fighting style. The Nightwalker is best suited for survival and being the center of combat. The Bot is a potent enemy debuffer and more ranged in options. And the Wraith specializes in focusing on one or two targets and keeping itself close to them. With that, we have gotten through a lot of the lore and flavor behind the Shade and their creation. A being shredded by guilt and bound together by the soul it cast into Shadowfell. Here you can see I already have sort of a set leveling thing that shows you your level, your proficiency, what features you unlock, what your spell slots are like, and how many of them you have. Because yes, shades do come with an element of magic, though I designed it to be vastly unique when compared to most other classes' breakdown of spell slots. Their hit points are not quite. They are heavily influenced by Warlock, but both more free and more restricted. As a tank class, they draw from one of the larger hit die types. They have the 1d10, so they're not to the 12 of the pure tank like the Barbarian is, but they do have the d10, which gives them a lot of health potential to work with. They also start with a proficiency with both light and medium armor, but don't start with heavy armor proficiency. Most shades are created accidentally and don't necessarily have a strong martial background to them, so they don't start with full proficiency with everything, like many martial classes do. They are proficient with all simple weapons and all melee martial weapons. Shades are intended to go into combat, and I wish to encourage that. You can play around with simple ranged weapons, though. If you wish to get into the real martial stuff, melee is your only starting option. They have proficiency with Constitution and Wisdom saving throws, and can choose their skills from Arcana, Acrobatics, Athletics, Stealth, Intimidation, Investigation, Insight, and Perception. And they have their own unique options for starting equipment. But now we get into their more unique feature, their casting ability, called Shadow Magic. The dark form of magic consumes your soul, at least temporarily, for its material needs and power sources. When casting a spell using shadow magic, you may ignore the need for magical focuses and magic component costs. This feature does not affect materials that have specific associated gold costs or must be consumed. Casting spells is not a memorized verse or a gift from another entity. Instead, you are calling on the unique features of your bounded soul and tempering them with shadow stuff. You do not have a highly varied spell slots. Instead, each spell you know through this class has a unique spell slot that can only cast the named spell. For each spell you know, you have one shade spell slot able to cast it at your maximum spell level. You may sacrifice 2 of your available shade spell slots to regain 1 spell slot of your choice. Shades are similar to warlocks in that they are limited in their spell availability. However, they're not limited by the number of spell slots they have in the way that warlocks are famous to being limited. Instead, they're limited by the flexibility of their spell slots. Where a warlock might have 2 spell slots they can use, a shade might have 4, but they cannot flex those spells. Each of those 4 spell slots can only cast their one assigned spell. Meaning, shades are encouraged to rotate through their spells instead of honing in on a simple, repeated strategy. They must instead look to what tools they have left to them, and not what they have done in the past. The final unique element to shades is as they draw on their soul, their very life essence. Constitution is your spellcasting ability for your shade spells. So you use Constitution whenever a spell refers to your spellcasting ability. In addition, you can use your Constitution modifier when setting the saving throw DC for shade spells you cast when you are making an attack roll with one. So since the shade only has 5 spells, does that mean that effectively at max level you can only cast 8 spells total despite having 11 slots? So every spell slot a shade gets should have, and perhaps I have mistyped something at a point, a spell already associated with it. They should never be gaining a spell slot unless they are gaining a spell that fills that slot. The best way to think about it is if a shade knows 11 spells, they have 11 spell slots, but each of those spell slots can only cast 1 spell, a specific spell. They can at any point, however, sacrifice 2 of their spell slots to regain a spell slot that they want. This, however, if it is used frequently, means they have half as many spells, or really a third of what they would initially expect. Oh, understand. Oh, wait, sorry. I just read spell level as spells. No, I'm a fool. No problem, no problem. Everything is a bit interesting, especially with this change I'm making to how the shade spells work and how to separate them from the other casters. At first level, the shade gains the Shadowy Disguise spell. Starting at level 1, you gain Shadowy Disguise spell slot and can cast Disguise Self, which is Shadowy Disguise is an edited version of. While your disguise is active, you have advantage on stealth checks and impose a disadvantage on investigation checks to discern if you are disguised while you are in dim light or darker. Additionally, when you are hit with an attack spell, an attacker with this spell is active, you may use your reaction to sever yourself from your disguise, gaining resistance to the triggering damage. This ends the spell and only affects the instigating attack's damage. You also gain the shade's most important feature, Cloaked in Shadow. You gain the Cloaked in Shadow spell slot, and you can use a bonus action to cast Cloak of Shadows. The spell lasts for 1 minute per spell level. While active, you gain the following features. You have resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. In addition, you can cast False Life at will, without expending a spell slot or material component. The Cloak of Shadows is very clearly highly inspired by the Barbarian's Rage ability, only it doesn't grant any damages or bonus features beyond its sort of resistance element. Also, this is one that doesn't come with counters on it. You get one spell slot to cast this. You can, of course, burn through your other spell slots to try and replace it, but it's important to make sure you're only granting yourself your general damage resistances when you're certain you'll need them. And finally, Weapon Shadow. You manipulate the shadow that trails your weapon to take an opponent off guard. Whenever you make a melee attack roll and miss, you may use your reaction to roll a second attack. On a hit, you deal half that attack damage. This feature is very important for a later feature of the Shade, based around their ability to mark enemies. This is a way to allow Shades to play more of a harasser role and not to feel overly punished for playing a tank position. You are more likely to hit. You can use your reaction to try again to hit. However, you will be dealing less damage. And this is a feature that can only be used once you've missed. I really enjoy it because my one player, Milkblade here, who plays around with it, definitely feels excited now whenever he misses an attack instead of wholly punished, because he knows he has an option to come back to it. You are, of course, giving up your reaction and so can't use opportunity attacks or certain other features. But I really like this ability's way to make players not feel down and out if they've missed their attack roll, especially early on when you only have one attack. Next on, we move to level 2. Adaptive Vision. You gain Dark Vision up to 30 feet. And if you already possess Dark Vision, you increase its range by 30 feet, up to a maximum of 120. And then, finally, a very big feature for Shades is the Marked by Shadows. This is heavily inspired by the Fighter's Cavalier subclass, which allows for marking on hit. When you hit a creature with a melee attack, you can mark the creature. You can have as many marks active as your Constitution modifier to a minimum of 1. While marked, a creature is afflicted with a Bane, giving them a -1d4 to attack rolls and ability saves. On the start of a marked creature's turn, they make a Wisdom saving throw versus your spell DC. However, they have disadvantage to the save if they are adjacent to you. The marks are removed and all effects end early if you are incapacitated or fall unconscious. Additionally, the mark is removed if the marked enemy starts its turn more than 60 feet away from you. These marks are the chief debuff that the Shade is dishing out. With each attack, they are decreasing the enemy's ability to fight by 1d4. These make them very good at marking and hitting a major enemy or splitting their attacks over a fight over many different enemies to try and make it harder for the enemy to really be dealing out consistent damage. Yes, this is where Weapon Shadow comes back. At level 1, it is a little weak, but once it's able to be used to make sure you can get at least one new mark every turn, it starts feeling more and more interesting. Then at level 3 comes the big choice, where you choose your path. The first thing that happens is you gain a new spell slot, the Shadowy Image spell, which is an edit on the mirror image. In addition to mirror image's base effects, If you are hit by a marked enemy while this spell is active, you can sacrifice one of your images to reduce the damage taken. Also, when you target an enemy with a melee attack, you can have a number of your shadowy images make an attack roll against the marked enemy adjacent to you. While attacking, these images use your attack rolls. On hit, the image dissipates and deals damage equal to your Constitution modifier. A major bit of lore within D&D is that shadow stuff, or the effects of the shadow fill, make illusions a bit more solid, a bit more present. And as such, they're able to better inflict damage, even though they're simply illusions. I wanted to kind of give this feeling of solidness to mirror image for the shades, just so they can have this little bit of bonus, but to make sure it doesn't go overpowered. This is not something that affects all enemies, whether you're being attacked or attacking them. This only affects enemies you've already marked. So this is where shades can start a snowball rolling in combat if they're able to consistently mark and focus down harassing enemies. Over the course of a battle, they become stronger and stronger as more enemies are marked by them. However, the chief choice at level 3 is your path. Whether you will walk the path of the Nightwalker, the Bodok, or the Wraith. As I mentioned when I was making this class, the 3 things I wanted them to do was to tank, to debuff, and to harass. And so their 3 paths all specialize in one. The Nightwalker is thus the tank. And when you take this, you gain the Presence of Night spell. As an action, you can cast Presence of Night. All adjacent marked enemies make a Wisdom saving throw. On a fail, they become grappled and are frightened of you until the start of your next turn. On a success, they are grappled. This effect ends if you end your turn more than 10 feet away from an enemy affected by the spell. A target may use its action to attempt to break this grapple by making a Strength or Wisdom saving throw versus your spell DC. The Nightwalker thus begins by being able to use its shadows to keep the enemy close to them, to keep them from escaping, and to make him their only target, and to make that target frightful. If you choose instead to walk the path of the Bodok, you gain Bodok's Gaze. As an action, you can cast Bodok's Gaze. Each marked enemy within 60 feet of you makes a Wisdom saving throw. On a fail, they become frightened of you for 1 minute. On a success, they are frightened till the end of their next turn. At the end of each of their turns, they can make a Wisdom saving throw. On a success, the spell ends. Yes, of course. So the comboing of the frightened with the grappled is really supposed to give them no good way to move. The Nightwalker wants the enemy to get in close and to be unable to escape. And then, as you've just now pointed out, also impose disadvantage, meaning that the Nightwalker has thus made themselves the only target, but also a horrible target. The Bodok, however, as you can see, is able to do things that influence a wider area of the battlefield. While they're not binding up the enemies, they are creating an area of fear for anyone they have marked. Finally, you can choose the path of the Wraith and the path that Milkblade now walks. You gain the Wraith Walk spell slot. This spell is cast using a move action instead of a normal action. Target one marked enemy within a range of your base movement speed and teleport to any space adjacent to this target. All marked enemies adjacent to you after this move make a Wisdom saving throw. On a fail, They have disadvantage on all attack rolls they make until the end of their next turn. That is no problem at all, Coops. Like I've said, I've spent over a year reading, rereading this, and going through it. And so I'm very familiar with a lot of its features. But please do not hesitate to ask or criticize it all. Like I've said, this is my baby, and I wish to keep editing and moving it closer and closer to being simple, understandable, unique, and balanced. So as you can see, the Wraith, instead of the wide area effect of the Bodok or the gripping effect of the Nightwalker, instead is able to move themselves to their target. They are not as AoE present, more so preferring one or two targets, but are able to keep themselves influential on that target, making them a very good harasser and very good at debuffing and keeping a major threat from living up to its full potential. Thank you very much, Kazay. At level 4, you gain the traditional ability score bonus. At level 5, like all martial classes, you gain an extra attack. Whenever you make the attack action, you can attack twice instead of once. Here is where shades really become able to come online. As they begin splitting their attacks between multiple targets on the same turn, they start marking more and more, capped, of course, by their modifiers, but still, now instead of one debuff around, a lucky person or someone making ample use of their weapon shadow should be able to start putting out on average 2 marks a turn, now making even larger battlefields less and less influential. At level 5, they also gain Shadow's Betrayal. This is a feature that now fights with weapon shadow, and that it also uses your reaction. Whenever a marked enemy deals damage to you or an ally, you may use your reaction to reduce the damage dealt by 1d6 plus your con mod. This reduction is increased to 2d6 plus your con mod at level 9 and 3d6 plus your con mod at level 11. Here was something I really wanted to play around with a shade, to give a balance to weapon shadow in a way. You can always use it to try and deal some more damage, or to try to put out an extra mark, or you can accept the miss and hold on to your reaction, and instead of playing the harassing role, play a much stronger tank, able to reduce damage either to yourself or, has been very well used in my campaign, to your allies. Encouraging your allies to now stand behind you and to fear your marked targets less and less, as not only do they become less likely to hit, but they become less able to deal damage when you are around. At level 6, you gain the Darkness spell and can cast Darkness. And you also take your next step on the path you've chosen. I would like to point out that at level 3, when you choose your path, that is basically your subclass, and you keep moving down that path, and don't get to mix and match together the different Nightwalker, Bodok, and Wraith feats. So, if you had chosen the Nightwalker, you now gain the Reaching Darkness spell. As an action, you can cast Reaching Darkness. All marked enemies make a strength saving throw. Actually, it is a little bit like the Barbarian, specifically the Ancestral subclass, which also possesses features to reduce damage done to your allies. Like I've said, I've been highly inspired by other classes, and while there are features I wish to make unique, I always make sure it's placed in that window of balance that does exist for D&D 5th edition. So that feature is actually very much inspired by the Ancestral Barbarian's ability to reduce damage done to his allies. Let's hear. All marked enemies make a strength saving throw with disadvantage. On a fail, you can move that creature in a straight line 10 feet closer to you. If they end this move adjacent to you, they are restrained. If they pass, their speed is reduced by 10 feet to the end of your next turn. The spell's effect ends after 1 minute, or if you fall unconscious. Here, the Nightwalker now is having tools to make everything fall within the domain of its influence. Where before they just keep things that are close to them and less effective, now they're able to reach out a bit and pull their marked enemies back to them and keep them close. The Nightwalker wants to be the focus, the tank, the draw for the enemy. On the Bodix path, you gain the Staring Void. As an action, you can cast Staring Void. Each marked enemy makes a Constitution save with disadvantage. On a failure, each enemy is afflicted with Bane and blinded for 1 minute. On a success, the enemy is blinded until the end of your next turn. At the end of each of their turns, the affected enemies can make a Constitution saving throw to end this effect early. The spell effect ends after 1 minute if you fall unconscious. It might be good to separate them in the style of the usual subclasses to clarify that. I really thought about it. I just kept being irritated with the way that D&D traditionally separates their subclasses into its own section. So that as you're reading through what you gain, like at level 6, you say, okay, I gained the darkness spell, and I pick a subclass. You scroll down to the bottom of the page and you go, okay, subclass, level 6, this one, there's the feature I gain. So this is where I wanted to mix them in a bit. I do agree I need to add in a better way of separating them here, but I do prefer having them included in the level section, just so it reduces the need to go searching for individual features. But yes, I do agree. Like, that is why I also wanted to point it out here, is I understand that that can lead, in its current format, to a bit of confusion. And I'm very open to suggestions, especially if there's any that allows them to stay kind of within where the levels go. So here you can see the Bodix is now starting to double up on its debuffs around it. It's creating both a Mark and a Bane. It's adding in blinded effects, and it's starting to make the entire battlefield weaker all at once. While it doesn't do the same job of the Nightwalker of pulling things close to itself, it does a good job of influencing its marks, even if they move away from it. If you think about it, forcing players to scroll down further is a good roleplay technique for breaking their will. Hey now. I don't wish to break my reader's will. I wish for everything to be right where it needs to be. And then finally, for level 6, the Wraith gains the Grasping Mist. As an action, you can cast Grasping Mist. Each marked enemy makes a Wisdom save. On a successful save for 1 minute, their speed is reduced by 10. On a fail, for 1 minute, the enemy's speed is reduced by half. And the first time they move 5 feet or more without teleporting on their turn, they take 2d4 con mod necrotic damage. The enemy makes a wisdom saving throw at the end of their turn to end the spell effect early. Could specify that you're taking a specific path at level 3 and then put Nightwalker path XXX for the later spell. That might work. You can make use of the digital format and use links to auto-scroll certain points. I guess that could work. Just kind of have an auto-scroll and then make sure each one also has an auto-scroll back up. Yeah, I might do that. Still feels very scrolly, but yeah, I need to make this more separated, I suppose. So here you can see the Wraith is now making its enemies slower to get away and punishing them for trying to escape its grasp. This spell is very much inspired by the Arcane Archers, one of their arrow types, which is also based around making it harder for enemies to move away from them and damaging them for doing so. The Wraith and its ability to chase and harass 1 or 2 targets is really exemplified here by punishing them for trying to get away. Thank you, Coops. No problem. Like I said, I really do want the criticism here. Like, the reason I felt the need to even point it out is as I'm reading it, I understand that this can lead to some confusion about what your choices are and which way you can go. So I think I might have to separate them much like you would a subclass and simply find the way to capture it more so like the barbarian's primal paths, I suppose. At 7th level, you gain the ability to cast Shadow Blade. You also gain the features Unveiled, where your dark vision now pierces magical darkness, and Evasive. When you're subjected to an effect that allows you to make a dexterity saving throw, you take only half damage instead, and take no damage if you succeed on the saving throw. Level 7, as you can see, is sort of just fleshing out almost flavorful what shades are, allowing them to pierce magical darkness, allowing them to avoid more saving throw damage, and just sort of giving them some options to work with. Yes, and that feature, as you can tell, is very much inspired by the Warlock's ability to pierce magical darkness using one of their features, though it does come in a bit later than the Warlock would be able to. I did want to get them the option, but I didn't want to negate the power that I feel a Warlock is supposed to be able to have early on. At level 8, of course, is an ability modifier. At level 9, you gain the ability to summon Lesser Shades, which is inspired by Summon Lesser Demons. I won't go through this whole spell as it is kind of a lengthy spell to begin with, but essentially you're able to summon up a few kind of predetermined shadow type creatures that are temporarily there to assist you. In fact, with the release of Tasha's, I had to laugh because I saw that Tasha's released a bunch of different edited versions of the Summon Lesson Demon spells, like Summon Lesson Fae, Summon Lesser Elemental, and I realized that I wasn't the only one probably making homebrew edited spell versions of this to allow people to dip into the different variants of creatures that exist. Then we go further down each of the route's paths. Only instead of a new spell, they now gain a passive. The Nightwalker gains Mired in Darkness. All marked enemies that start their turn adjacent to you are restrained versus your spell DC. You also gain 1 bonus to your AC and all your saving throws for each adjacent marked enemy. This is the level that the real paths begin to explode. Level 9 and level 10 is where most classes really start to hit you with, this is what the class is about. And for the Nightwalker, that is getting into the middle of combat, gripping the enemy, pulling them in close, and becoming tankier and tankier the more the enemy desperately tries to deal with you. And so here, the Nightwalker restrains those that are adjacent to them and begins to almost use the enemy as a shield for itself. This is where the Nightwalker becomes the true tank of the battlefield. The Bodok, however, gets the impending aura. All marked enemies that start their turn within 15 feet of you are frightened of you. All marked enemies that start their turn within 15 feet of you have their attack and spell damage reduced by your con mod plus proficiency. To remember, Bodoks still have to mark enemies, and that requires them to be going into melee and marking with attacks. And they are capped by the number of marks they can do. So while this seems a very powerful constant effect to have, it is also very controlled by the fact that they'll never have an absurd number of marks out, and that they have to put themselves in threat range of almost every creature to really make good use of this. But here's where the Bodok comes online as being the constant battlefield debuff, where the Nightwalker wants to be in the very center of the enemy. The Bodok wants to be in the very center of its allies, influencing the enemy. It would be cool is maybe make 3 sub-variants that got some extra proficiencies, like with Cleric, Nightwalker getting heavy armor, maybe Intimidation, bonus proficiency, stealth, don't know. Just feel like there should be a good way to get heavy armor on Nightwalker without racial stuff or feats. I do understand that. I believe with these, I was more so inspired by the primal paths of the Barbarian, and so I didn't want them to have, like, bonus proficiencies and the like. And also with the Nightwalker's ability to use magic, especially without materials, and to create its own resistances, I didn't want to give it heavy armor or encourage heavy armor use to double up with that. Instead, I wanted them to be like barbarians in that they can gain resistance using one of their spell slots. But an advantage they have over barbarians is they can use medium armor, whereas barbarians, I don't believe, can rage while in medium or heavy armor. So while I understand a desire for a shade to go into heavy armor, I almost like the idea of them having to spend a bit more to do that, so that they're kind of in the way saying, I can wear armor with this feature, unlike the barbarians, but it's going to cost me something to really take that the whole 9 yards. And then finally, for coming into their own, is the Wraith. All marked enemies that start their turn adjacent to you have their movement speed reduced by half. You no longer spend reactions to use weapon shadow against marked enemies. Anytime you make an attack of opportunity, you may instead choose to use weapon shadow feature. This is where the Wraith simply is the harasser. Their free use of weapon shadow allows them to be able to really attack a lot, though at half damage, and only really against marked enemies. So against enemies they've already hit and are focusing down. Now, of course, this does require them either to already have missed an attack or for the enemy to be trying to move away from them. But that is exactly where the Wraith is supposed to shine. When it has one target it's trying to prevent from moving or trying to keep focus on. The Wraith lives in harassing 1 or 2 targets. And this is where they come into their own, able to constantly deal small amounts of damage and prevent the escape of its enemies. A certain monk, I could take this guy, just have to hit and run punch. Yeah, teleports behind him. That is the fun thing for the Wraith, is the ability to teleport behind him. At level 10, you gain the Bestow Curse spell slot. You also gain the Muted Souls feature. Whenever a marked enemy would deal damage to you, you can use your reaction to reduce the damage by half. Here now shades have essentially begun to more and more punish their already marked targets. Once you're marked by a shade, as they grow in power, they become near impossible to deal with. They are the true tank that will punish you if you ignore them. At level 11, they gain Hardened Souls and can no longer become frightened. Additionally, you have advantage on saving throws against being magically charmed. You gain +1 to your AC and all saving throws. Level 11 is a very simple level in a way. It simply makes you just that tick stronger, more resistant. It's very powerful as a level in the way that it affects numbers, but is also not so much introducing any more spell slots or any more features to use, simply saying, yes, live the life of the tank. At level 12 is the ability score. At level 13, you gain a pair of features that again punish your marked targets. Whenever a marked target starts its turn adjacent to you, targets you with an attack roll, or casts a spell that includes you as a target, they take necrotic damage equal to your con mod plus proficiency. Not a large amount of damage, but a fun punishment. And Blinding Shadow. When a marked enemy would critically hit you with an attack roll, you instead suffer a normal hit. Any effect triggered by the critical hit does not trigger. This is the beautiful tank element of the Shade. Once it has marked an enemy, it will not be slain with a single strike. You will have to do a lot to kill a Shade, for even a critical hit, if they have influenced you with their darkness, will not drive them away. At level 14, you gain the Enervation spell slot. As a Nightwalker, you gain the Life Transference spell slot, allowing you to share your tankiness more easily with your allies. You also gain Wall of Darkness. When a marked enemy targets an adjacent ally with an attack or spell, that ally may use your current AC or saving throw in place of their own. Now the Nightwalker has reached a power of tankiness where it is said, you might as well kill me first, for my allies are under my protection, under my shadow. As the Bodic, you gain the Counter spell slot. Just one, of course, but a very interesting one. You also gain Dark Vengeance. Once per round, when a marked enemy would target you or an ally within 60 feet of you with an attack spell, you may roll 1d8 plus your con mod plus proficiency. The enemy takes that much necrotic damage, and a number of allies up to your con mod gains that many temporary hit points. Here the Bodic is now also influencing its allies better by saying, I have some temporary hit points for all of you. I will make sure that as the debuffer, I'm giving you all a bit of protection as well. And at this level, the Wraith gains the Vampiric Touch spell slot and Blurring Shadows. Whenever a marked target takes an attack action or casts a spell while within your movement range, you may make a special opportunity attack against them, as if you had reached up to your movement speed. This attack is considered a melee attack with your current weapon made by your shadow. Here is where Wraiths become a horrifying creature on the battlefield, because now everywhere in their movement speed is within their reach, as they seem to blink or cast their shadow across the field whenever anyone is attacking their allies within their range. The Wraith will not do a lot of damage with these attacks, but will punish anything trying to ignore them. Now, the thing to remember is they are not a Bodic. They are a Shade. They're simply walking the path of those horrifying undead beings. So make sure your picnic is not to a terrifying unlife creature that will suck the soul from you. Now we move to level 15, where you gain resistance to necrotic damage. After all, it is the life you live. And Smothering Shadows. All marked enemies adjacent to you count as being flanked. This is a feature to consider in all campaigns, as not all campaigns will actually run a specific flanked variant, as it is not an official rule within D&D, simply a variant rule many people play with. As such, this is one to know going in, to ask your DM whether flanking either has a home rule they're doing or a variant they're running. Otherwise, this is simply a feature that is more a homebrew feature to come up when it's available. At level 16, you gained an ability score. At level 17... Okay. All right, I'll see you, Coops. And please, please, if anyone decides to play around with this, do let me know. I'm always excited. At level 17, you gain Dominating Shadow. You may re-roll a failed saving throw once every short rest. This is inspired by the fighter's Indomitable feature. You also gain extra attack. Beginning at 17th level, you can attack 3 times instead of once whenever you take the attack action. Level 18 is where we start getting into the horrifying area, where you gain Bounded Soul. Whenever your HP reaches 0 or lower, without suffering instant death, you may choose to occupy your shadowed soul to continue the fight. This effect lasts for 1 minute. During this duration, your body is considered unconscious, but you do not make death saving throws. You are also, however, not considered stabilized. Additionally, your physical body cannot be healed. All healing performed on it can only stabilize it, as you will need to continue death saving throws once this effect ends. Your shadowed soul form possesses all of your abilities and is considered resistant to all non-magic attacks. Your shadowed soul, however, is vulnerable to radiant damage. All your damage die are considered automatic 1s. Your shadow HP is equal to your con mod D times D10 hit die. If your shadow's HP drops to 0, the effect of this feature ends. Additionally, if your body had been stabilized, you re-enter it in a re-dying state and take 1 automatic failed death saving throw with disadvantage. This is a way for when the shade gets knocked down or killed, their shadow seems to separate from their body and allows the player to keep influencing the battlefield. All their damage die are now automatic 1s, but they are resistant to a lot of damage. This Bounded Soul feature is about re-influencing, remarking, and being a presence on the battlefield, even once you've been slain. Though, of course, not yet dead. This is the horror of a shade, that their soul has been ripped loose to a degree that allows them to fight just like a shadow would. Level 19, you gain your last ability score, and at level 20, you get the expanded soul. You embody and master the powers of the Fel and of your bounded soul. Your constitution score increases by 4. Your maximum for that score is now 24. Additionally, you may choose any one other ability score and increase that score by 2 and its max by 2. This is, of course, inspired by the Barbarians level 20, where they also gain a breaking of the top points for ability score modifiers. But as we have reached level 20, we've reached the end of the discussion of my homebrew races and classes, of Alexander Perrault's of Fey and Fel. And, unfortunately, I appear to have taken far too long to discuss it, as that is where we will have to be ending the stream for today, and leaving off story time for my next stream. In fact, given what has happened, I have already decided that my next stream, coming up next Saturday, will exclusively be a story time stream. One where we will go through several sessions and the entire next arc of my player's campaign as they leave Scarin and head into Polamont, into Arena, on their next job. I do apologize for getting people's hopes up that there would be story time today. I simply lost track of time going through all my races and classes, and perhaps should think about budgeting time a bit better during my next stream, though I do hope everybody enjoyed learning about these things that I have made and have become interested in showing them off to their friends or DMs and maybe providing me with a bit of free play testing. While I'll be cutting the stream short here, I do want to open up the end of my stream as always. Oh my god, Leon. I hope that you had a delightful stream. I'm very sorry I missed it. Wanted to stop by and shoot some good vibes and some... Thank you so much for the fucking bits, my dude. I'm sorry you missed the stream, but as with all my streams, I'll be making sure to download it and upload it to the archive, where some of them currently are already. And that should be up by tomorrow noon. So don't worry, Leon. You'll be able to catch all my homebrew races and classes. For the last 5 minutes of the stream, then, I would like to open everything up to questions, comments, things anybody thinks, just that initial look they'd really like to see me change or edit about any of this. Anything that anyone wants to send to me about their own homebrewing, I'd love to take a look at. Questions, ideas, comments, or anything you'd like to see in future streams. Or simply telling me whether you enjoyed today's stream or not, as it was a little more single focused than most of my other D&D streams have been. Thank you. Sub to the YouTube channel. Thank you very much, Leon. How's everyone else doing now that we're drawing to the end? Has my ASMR programmed voice done a good job of rocking everybody into comfort? What do you think of Tasha's psionic class options and feats? I'm trying them out for the first time in game. They seem fun. I do like some of the psionic stuff. I'll be honest, I personally love more so the lore of psionics being this more like aberrant thing and something only the aberrant races or monsters have. But I do enjoy the idea of opening them up. Mind Sliver is a cantrip I love and really want to play around with. The idea of debuffing an enemy's saving throw is absolutely enticing to me. Let's see here. All the Shadowfell stuff looks super cool, and I'll have to use it in the future in some games. Yes, no. Shadowfell, like I said, was my big inspiration for kind of this supplement I've been working on. There's just so much like scattered lore about it to really sink your teeth into, but it's so disconnected that it leaves a lot of room to create your own connective tissue to tie it into your own campaigns in really interesting and unique ways. How was your day? My day was good. I actually got to look around a few apartment buildings today, and I've started the application process for moving into a new location in the coming months. So I do apologize. It won't be until April, but there may be a couple of weeks coming up where I won't be able to stream for a while, as I'll be moving and creating a new power and Wi-Fi account at a new apartment building. But that won't be for at least another month coming here. Well, 4 a.m. Thanks for the stream. I'll catch you on the next one. Catch you too, Al Frost, and unless anyone else has anything big, I think that is where I will too be calling it for the evening. Thank you all for coming, and I'll give everybody a couple of quick freebies. First, a little kick, if I can find it. And of course, because all of you were so complimented to my voice today, I will give you what I know you all wish to hear. Ra-ra. And with that very strange moment, I away. Good night to all of you, and I hope to see you all next weekend, or perhaps on the archive. Good night.